today's World Insight with Tianwei. The Iran nuclear deal in limbo as the U.S. stepped up sanctions and Gulf military presence. Can the deal be saved? And the fate of ancient heritage sites hangs in the balance between commercial and conservation interests. Two culture scholars share their insights.
But when you don't have roots, your tree is not going to grow strong. And it may not matter in one generation, but it does matter.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We start in Tehran, where Iran made its move 1 year after the U.S. pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal. On Wednesday, Iran said it would start enriching uranium again unless the remaining signatories of the deal give the country's economy a hand as the U.S. doubles down on its sanctions against Iran.
As Tehran stares down Washington in a battle of nerves, remaining signatories to the Iran nuclear deal are under increasing pressure to step in. On Wednesday, Iran said it would stop complying with the nuclear deal unless other powers help the country bypass renewed U.S. sanctions in the next 60 days.
The Europeans always see America as the sheriff. This kind of thinking does not allow them to make firm decisions for their own national interests.
While the other 5 parties to the nuclear deal, also known as JCPOA, have all repeatedly said they wanted to keep the deal, their support is not much help to Iran's struggling economy. Last year, President Trump reimposed sanctions against Iran. Last week, the U.S. canceled sanction waivers to the biggest buyers of Iranian oil, demanding these countries also stop doing business with Iran. And following Iran's announcement on Wednesday, Mr. Trump ordered new sanctions on Iran's steel, aluminum, copper, and iron sectors. Besides economic measures, the U.S. is also flexing its military muscle on Iran by dispatching forces to the Persian Gulf last week. The animosity is reciprocal after the White House designated Iran's elite paramilitary Revolutionary Guard a foreign terrorist organization last month. Iranian lawmakers chanted in parliament, "Death to America." Meanwhile, Iranians are struggling to make ends meet as inflation soars. According to the IMF, brain drain is taking place with more than 150,000 educated Iranians leaving the country every year. Unemployment, too, has skyrocketed to around 30%.
Negotiating with the United States is useless. We have talked enough with Europe too, and they should do what they are supposed to before a 60-day deadline. These days it is really impossible for a worker to provide for their family. We are trying to overcome the US despite our situation.
The lifting of sanctions got Iran into limiting parts of its nuclear program in 2015. Without reciprocal benefits to the restrictions, Iran may indeed resume uranium enrichment.
So what's likely to be the fate of the Iran nuclear deal, and how are the countries used to be on board now looking at its future? Let's take our guest from Iran first. In Tehran, Professor Mohammad Marandi, Professor and Dean of the World Faculty Studies from the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, welcome to our program. I want to have 2 to 3 quick questions with you, Professor. First, Professor, what do you make, together with the government in Iran, of the latest over the weekend military move by the United States, shifting some more forces? USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group together with a bomber task force to the Middle East. Is Iran in the danger of a war?
Well, the feeling is in Tehran that the U.S. government and the state do not want war because they know that if they initiate any military conflict, that would be disastrous for the global economy. The whole of the Persian Gulf would be at risk. The Iranians, of course, they have spent the last 20 years building up defenses, underground cities, highly developed missile systems that would be directed at its adversaries. The invasion of Iraq really change the mentality in this country. So with all the facilities and the equipment that the Iranians have, and the fact that all the oil wells and tankers and gas fields, they are very vulnerable. Any conflict would basically mean a major global economic depression, probably something that we've never seen in the last century. So the Americans know that war is not a possibility. But then again, you have people like Pompeo, who is a fundamentalist.
My question for you is, Professor Morandi,
who believes in the rapture.
Is Iran prepared for any kinds of war if the other side strike first, or find excuse or reasons to start military conflict? Professor Morandi, very briefly from you, sir, please.
Yes, I think that while the Iranians do not want war, that's why the Iranians signed the nuclear agreement, to show the international community that Iran's not the problem, and that contrary to U.S. accusations that have been going on for many years, that the Iranians are looking for peace and stability in the region. And even though the Americans exited the agreement and the Europeans have failed to abide by the agreement over the last year, the Iranians have waited an extra year now. And even now they're giving it 2 extra months to show that they do not want confrontation. But Iran has prepared itself over the past 2 decades. The Americans simply cannot win a war, and Iran has many allies across the region, in Iraq, and in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan. But most importantly is the fact that 20 million barrels a day of oil and alongside gas would be at risk. So the Americans, if the more sane people in the U.S. government, they would definitely refrain from moving in that direction.
We're running out of time for this section, so if Professor Morandi, briefly also, please, an answer from you as well about the sanctions coming from the U.S. We understand it's not just about the oil sanctions, but also some of the other aluminum, ore, steel. So what would that mean for Iran's economy? Is Iran once again prepared for further devastation as a result of sanctions?
Well, the Iranians have been dealing with sanctions for 4 decades, and the actions of the United States show how brutal the U.S. government is, in that it is targeting ordinary Iranians, just like in Venezuela it targets ordinary people, just like in Libya, in Yemen alongside the Saudis, it's starving ordinary people. The United States, when it wants to get its way, it allows itself to do anything. But the Iranian economy is a diverse economy. It has 15 neighbors. It does extensive trade with its neighbors. And as we speak, Iran continues to export substantial amounts of oil to its partners. And also, Iran is selling a large amount of oil on the open seas at a discount of $3.50 to $4 a barrel, which is not that hard because Iranian oil is inexpensive. But Iran is going to begin to push back, and Iran's patience is waning thin, just as we see with the nuclear program. And so, for example, if countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates continue to go along with Trump in trying to strangle the Iranian economy, then Iran will begin to make the road ahead bumpy for these 2 countries.
All right. Professor Mohammad Morandi, coming from University of Tehran in Iran, thank you so much. Stay with us here. We'll be continuing our discussion about this topic after this break, bringing insiders from different parts of the world on the issue. And for more on the Iran nuclear deal issue, we are joined in Washington, D.C., Daniel Server, Director of the Conflict Management and American Foreign Policy Programs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. He's also a research scholar at the Middle East Institute. In Brussels, we are joined by Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. And in Beijing, China, we have Zhou Rong, a senior analyst from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, go to you, Mr. Server. Do you think the U.S. is trying to pick up a war with Iran with the military move and also double down of sanctions and, of course, the early withdrawal from the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal?
I think America is not ready for war. It's very difficult to tell what the administration is trying to do. Mr. Bolton, the National Security Advisor, seems to be ready for war, but the President does not.
All right, Mr. Cameron, of course, European capitals are watching this very closely. We have the latest suggesting the European capitals saying we do not want any kind of ultimatum, but at the same time committed still to the JCPOA earlier Iran nuclear deal. What does that mean, Mr. Cameron?
Well, the Europeans are fighting hard to preserve the deal. They still think it is the best way to keep the Iranian nuclear threat in a box. They have regular reports from the IAEA in Vienna that Iran is complying fully with all the aspects of the deal. So at the moment, the position of the EU, despite the changed views of the United States to impose more sanctions, is to try and save the deal. It's going to be difficult, but that is the position of the EU.
China, of course, says it appreciates Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal and resolutely opposes the U.S. unilateral sanctions. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang said this. China, quote, regrets that the U.S. has further aggravated tensions over Iran. Take a look.
We call for all the parties to stay restricted and enhance dialogue so as to prevent the escalation of tensions. China will keep contact with relevant parties and continue to make efforts on maintaining and implementing the comprehensive deal. In the meantime, we will firmly defend the legitimate and proper rights of Chinese enterprises.
Mr. Zhou, of course, the Chinese import oil from Iran, just like the Europeans, like the South Koreans, and like Japan as well. So what is China going to do if the U.S. continue its unilateral sanctions against countries importing oil from Iran?
Yes, of course, China have to reduce some of the import from Iran, I mean the oil import from Iran. But China may not stop its import from Iran. For one thing, because it is America, not Iran, to violate the rule first, the rule of the deal first. It is America, not Iran, not to disobey the rule. So China do not have to follow America. China may maintain very normal trade relation with Iran, but based on the condition, how can China can resist the sanction from the United States?
Okay. Now, Mr. Server, the fact that within the administration, Mr. Bolton, Secretary Pompeo also seem to be joining the group, while at the same time acting Defense Secretary has been talking quite harsh against Iran. Will this kind of consensus continue within certain key officials of the administration? What would that mean for the president when he's making the final decision?
One thing we've learned about President Trump is that he's really totally unpredictable, erratic, inconsistent. So it's anybody's guess, and that creates a real problem for Europe, for China, and for Iran, that the Americans are so difficult to read.
Mr. Cameron, of course, the Europeans probably are the ones that have to work hard on this if you do not have a very reliable partner, such as the United States. Well, probably reliable is too much of a word to use in this case. Mr. Cameron, now, what can the European capitals do? On the one hand, importing oil from Iran is a big source of the European consumption. On the other hand, the Europeans want to have a rule-based world, committing to earlier agreement of JCPOA. Meanwhile, the Europeans are also concerned if the Middle East goes on with further fires of war and conflicts, because the floods of illegal immigrants and problems would all be exporting to the European continent. So, Mr. Cameron, it seems that the Europeans now really have to think hard about what to do.
Well, indeed, it's in a very difficult situation for Europe, because the United States' reach in terms of sanctions is very large indeed, because all dollar transactions run through New York. So any company that does deals not only with the United States but elsewhere in the world that uses dollars can be hit by these sanctions. So already you've had all the big European companies like Siemens, Airbus, etc., say we are not going to deal with Iran because our business in the United States is far more important. So this leaves smaller, medium-sized countries to try and deal with Iran, try and help the Iranian economy as the European Union promised. But they're also under threat now from sanctions from the US, and what's left is a very small vehicle to actually engage in some kind of barter payments, essentially for small-scale trading between the EU and Iran. So that is the situation just now. Very, very difficult for Europe.
And not to mention, the sanctions now is not just about oil, but also about raw materials, as we mentioned earlier, isn't it, Mr. Cameron?
Absolutely, but I mean, the European economy is not dependent at all on Iranian oil or any exports from Iran, but we are trying to ensure that as part of the deal that Iran signed, we promised to help the Iranian economy, and that is now proving quite difficult in the light of the US sanctions. So most European governments totally opposed to what the United States is doing, but of course there are bigger interests at stake here in terms of their own economic relations with the US and also security relations with the US.
But Mr. Cameron, as we know, there were already companies being established by the European countries, whereby European companies joining together to deal with Iran as a second source, in a way, indirectly, so that the European companies, particularly big ones, would not be able to be harmed directly by the sanctions. Will those kinds of middle way be able to work? And meanwhile, under what kind of mechanism the European capitals work on the issue of Iran? Will it just be the EU itself, or the EU can work with the other members, remaining members of the JCPOA together, but how?
Well, there is a company set up based in France called Instex, and the idea there is initially this is open to other European member states and then later to China, Russia, other countries to take part. But it's very small beer. It's actually only just got off the ground, and the idea is to have some kind of barter arrangement whereby a company in Italy importing, say, pharmaceuticals but exporting oil or vice versa, they could do that transaction through this company in euros, so the international financial markets are not involved. But it's quite cumbersome, and it's not going to involve any big companies, and I don't think it's going to make a real difference in the short term to the Iranian economy, and that's the problem.
And what about the mechanism to work with the other remaining members of the JCPOA? Is there a mechanism? Can there be a mechanism?
Yes,
a stable one, please.
Well, it's just started now. It's a legal company based in France, and it will be open probably in the next couple of months to third countries to take part. But as I say, very small share capital, quite cumbersome to operate, and it's not really going to be a game changer.
Mr. Zhou, of course, to you as well, what about China's opinion as to what kind of mechanism can the remaining members of the JCPOA be able to work together? Of course, Mr. Cameron mentioned twice about the company that is about the commercial ties, but what about politically together, as Iran has already decided to enriching the uranium, and the U.S. already 1 year ago decided to withdraw from the overall deal?
Shall we just think about one idea that we never think about 5+1? Before that is United States, Britain, France, Germany, China, Russia, plus Iran. Right now we can just have 5+1 without America. If 5 countries stay together, we can make some certain kind of mechanism. I think the deal, Iranian nuclear deal, may maintain to a certain way. And also, SPV as well as Intex maybe the small and only can do some humanitarian aid. But in the future, 5 countries put their head together, we can have more very rational idea. And Iran is a rational country which will not positively launch any kind of attack against America.
All right. Mr. Server, we only have 1 minute left. I want to ask your opinion as well. Can the U.S. now, literally, be able to afford more chaos in the Middle East, whether it is directly about Iran or indirectly toward Iran? Mr. Server.
I think the Americans want to talk with Iran, and they want to settle this at the negotiating table. Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Trump have been talking about talking with Iran for months now. The Iranians don't like the conditions that the Americans are imposing, and that's quite understandable. But I do believe that there is an opening in the next couple of weeks to begin to defuse the current crisis.
What do you mean by the next couple of weeks? You have to explain a little bit, right? Very briefly, sir.
Well, if it goes on more than a couple of weeks, you've got the carrier battle group in the Gulf. You've got tensions ratcheting up again. I think it becomes much more difficult if the current crisis continues to get back to the negotiating table.
All right,
but
Daniel
I do think
Server.
both in Tehran and in
Daniel Server, David Fraser Cameron, and also Joe Rome, thank you so much for being with us, the three of you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The fate of ancient heritage sites hangs in the balance between commercial and conservation interests. Two culture scholars share their insights after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Protecting the legacy of our cultural ancestors can be challenging. When a heritage site is a popular tourist attraction, there is a tendency to over-commercialize it with a sea of vendors. When a site does not pay for itself with tourist revenues, conservation efforts are doubly hard. So what's the best approach? I asked two cultural scholars from India and Mexico who are quite experienced with the preservation efforts. What are some of the challenges facing you and your country when doing protection of ancient civilizations?
Well, in India, there are lots of sites which are already known. You know, people will talk about the Taj Mahal. People will talk about sites they know. And the government is protecting thousands of sites. But like with China, no matter how much you have protected, like with Mexico, there are so many small sites which still need protection, which are unknown, and which are then left to the local people to preserve. So the challenge there is to make sure that local communities understand how important the past is, not just for the present, but for the future.
Is it difficult to do?
It is difficult. The local people are willing to do it, but money matters. So if today, to have a high-rise building means something more, they will not care about that little shrine which is on somebody's, that little memorial of somebody who fought maybe 2,000 years ago. Somebody fought and died. And they'll say, huh. But the old men don't. Old women and old men recognize it. But the young ones say the past is the past. We need to live in the future. I think they need to realize the future, the present, and the past are all linked.
And what about you, Olga? Mexico.
In Mexico, we have more than 60 languages, for instance, and groups of indigenous people all over the country, but especially in the southeast of Mexico. And these people are starting sometimes to not want to speak their own languages. And we talk about an ancient poem in Nahuatl language that is from Mexico, center of Mexico, that says something like that. When a language dies, you do not have the manner to talk about a bird or the beauty of the sunset or the tree, because you don't have the ways to do it.
But are they going to be persuaded? How can you persuade them? Is it easy to persuade them?
No, it is not, but they're wanting to do it. You know, we have a school in Gulf of Mexico, close to a place in an archaeological site. This school is exactly that. It has all the traditions. The school teaches languages, teaches crafts, teaches ways of being, of taking care of their elders. And this is what we have to develop in our country.
But then, will one school, Rima, really save one civilization?
Olga, I have a story here, a way I would like to share with you. And this story is from at least 1,000 years ago. And I think, again, it will appeal to people who are listening to me in China or in Mexico or in India. A king from he wasn't a king, a warrior of very humble origin. There was an attack, he became the commander, he became the king. Having become a king, he married into a very royal family, and he took all the behavior of a royal. So he did not like the local language he had grown up with. And he forbade someone from speaking it. He said, speak in Sanskrit. So it's like speaking, perfect Mandarin, not the local languages. His old court poets then went away because he composed in the old language. Now, with time, maybe 10 years, 20 years later, this king went out hunting. He got separated from the others, and he came to a forest where there was absolute peace. And he heard this beautiful sound, and he followed it. And he found that birds were sitting on the trees, and there was a tiger and an elephant and a leopard, and all were sitting next to each other. And an old man with a long white beard was reciting beautiful poetry in the local language. And as he recited, he was burning each leaf. Those long leaves of the old days. And he said, stop, who are you? Why are you burning this? This is beautiful. And the old man looks at him and he says, O king, do you not recognize me? You forbade me to use that language. So the king realized his mistake, that yes, you need the perfect language, but you need the local language. You need the imperfect and the perfect to have a harmonious world. Now, this is written about. So if this realization can happen to a king, I think it can happen to communities if we choose to work with them. If we can make them proud of an international culture that they belong to, but also of the local culture which comes from their heart.
But people will argue, Rima, Olga, both of you are coming from well-off families, you're well-educated, you're the elites of the society. Of course you want the culture to be what it is, but for those who are living in the huts, which might be there for about 500 years or even 1,000 years, they want to live in modernity. What do you make of this kind of argument?
When I was in the National Monuments Authority of India, that is a choice we had to have, because the rules were such that if there was a monument like this one, the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City, people who were illegally there, who didn't have papers to be there, but they've been there 50 years, 100 years, they're not supposed to be there according to the government and according to law, but they are there. Because they are there, the tourists can have restrooms, they cannot, because they are meant to be moved out. And so we were arguing for them to have those things. It also helps in our countries to be able to say, hey, listen, I am what I am thanks to my parents having gone in for education, because that's where I come from. I come from where you were. So my father grew up reading in the light of a lantern, and he became what he is, and he was conscious of his culture. So it needs talking, it needs negotiation. It also needs, which is why it is very relevant for the younger people to not only look to certain international countries as, that is where we want to go because there has a better standard of life. Because you may not have it there. You need to work as hard. So if you have pride of where you are, and pride I don't mean, just to say, oh, we are the oldest, we are the best. That doesn't mean anything. But I am what I am. If I'm poor and I have torn shoes, but I'm wearing something that my grandmother made, I'm proud of it.
Compared to India, Olga, you're from Mexico. I'm sure there are more diversities in terms of protecting civilizations. Even more challenging, I would assume.
Yes, but you can communicate. You can communicate if you relate to them in their own way of being, in their own heart, not from a high position, not from the desk that you decide on public policy. The housing industry in Mexico has wanted to make homes in concrete and brick to the people there, and they have had to see how horrible it is to have concrete homes because it's very hot or very cold in the winter, and the knowledge of the ancient people that have built their homes in different ways, in mud, in very thick walls and very high ceilings, things like that are becoming again something that is necessary to maintain.
But the question is, how much do we know? How much can we learn from our ancient civilizations?
There is no question we can learn a lot.
Are we smart enough to learn?
Maybe the people are, but also at government levels across the world, you know, internationally, all governments, regional governments, state governments, national governments, need to know that policy making is not enough. You know, the policy maker, I know they may be in touch with the locals, but you need to be in constant dialogue with people. Because if you want to remove my little one-room hut and give me a huge palace somewhere, I might have an emotional connect. Or I might just say, yes, I will go for the high-rise. But then, you know, what happens to the old grandmother who can wander down to the local market on days when her knees are good? We forget that. What happens to the old great-grandfather who can hardly see? But if he goes down the little street he lives in, he's lived there maybe all his life, there's a connect, which may not be in the high-rise, which may not be in the modern materials, which may not be in a lot of things. How do we choose? Who chooses? Who is the best person? And how informed should you be? Should it just be the majority decide? Right. You know, that's democratic, so will a majority decide? Will a noble leader decide? How much, because in the past you had good rulers who listened, and you had good rulers who were totally autocratic and did not listen, and you had bad rulers who did the same. So how can we, at a small level and at the international level, listen to our past, listen to the people around us, listen to each other, and then come to informed decisions.
But have you got some answers?
No, I don't think, do you?
Well, I don't.
I wish we did.
I wish we did.
But I think we can seek for them. I mean, just not as a joke, but seriously, we need to think. We need to think consciously in whatever field of life we are in.
But what about that ultimate question? I mean, results vis-a-vis efficiency. What about short term? What about long term? You know, when policies are being drawn, all of these issues need to be taken into consideration.
Well, many times the trade-off is tourism, for instance. We want the money from the tourists, and we want them to come and see these ancient civilizations, and we do not have a management plan for visiting the tourism. We let everyone come in and destroy what we wanted to show off. I think the politicians need to know how to show these ancient civilizations, but without destroying the hen of the golden eggs, without showing, letting everybody come in and everybody sell things and everybody go and ask for money, and really destroy this beauty in the sense of community.
Have you seen some heart-aching examples?
Yes, Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it is a horrible market. It's impossible to visit. It's filled with people selling. You cannot see. They are using the Chichen Itza for concerts.
But some would say, isn't that nice? I mean, more people got to know this specific cultural heritage site as a result.
No, because what you do is make it become commercial. Make it become, the people will go into the Chichen Itza space that is a sacred space, and it's still sacred for many Mayans. It becomes a place to have fun, to hear music, yes, very nice music, but You can have these players have concerts somewhere else and raise awareness, yes, but somewhere else, not in this sacred, very special space.
I want to come back to that word you use, about time. Because we look at something and we say, and I've heard this recently in India, that instead of preparing mortar, which takes 20 years, they say, we don't have the time for it. And I said to myself, wait a minute. And I said to them, people lived maybe shorter lives than we did in the past. If they had the time, why do we suddenly feel that we have to do everything in a hurry? Why does change have to come in a hurry? Why do we need to look at short-term benefits for everything? Why can we not realize that the ancient civilizations have survived because they gave the benefit of knowledge to each other? They realize that it takes time to do things, that short-term fixes will just be short-term fixes. So you have, sudden tourists coming in. In the long term, it will not keep the culture or civilization going. And you can say, well, so what's wrong with that? Let's destroy it. But when you don't have roots, your tree is not going to grow strong. And it may not matter in one generation, but it does matter. Again, what keeps coming back to our countries, to China, to Mexico, to India, is, yes, this building is interesting, this monument is interesting, but we need to have money to make it go. So use it for something else. Why should an old building, which has already lasted its time, need to justify itself in the future? It's like, asking a great-grandmother who has worked hard, she's carried people on her shoulders, now just wants to sit in the sun, and you say, no, what money is she bringing in? Well, I think something in our thinking needs to be concentrated to look for solutions and not just look at simplistic solutions.
Well, maybe most of you don't care about the speed, but so many people around you, they do. They talk about speed, they talk about everything needs to happen fast, overnight, they talk about money. They value what is the latest rather than the ancient and the past. What can you do?
Yes, definitely. I think that what we have to do is be more humble and understand that the knowledge that these people can give us is much more than what we can give them. And therefore, we have to really understand and learn how to listen. And maybe for the young, we have to teach them to listen. They don't want to listen. They have too many things to care about and to think about. Teach how to listen, how to understand, how to be more empathic with them, with these societies, that the only thing they need is someone to hear, to understand them.
What can we do? It's the we, where you realize that, Mexico has certain issues, they're dealing with it. China has certain issues, they're dealing with it. Iran, Iraq, all the countries present here have issues and problems, and together we can do. Individually, maybe you would need to be, somebody really special to be able to call the shots to do it. Maybe people in the media can make a difference. So we need to just, I think, get together perhaps and convey this urgency for this, but the importance of it. If civilizations have lasted for 3,000, 4,000, 500,000 years, they will not unless we give them that importance and unless we do our bit.
Well, ladies, when you travel around the world, what kind of common grounds, India, Mexico, China, some of the other ancient civilizations, do you find among them when you are walking inside a Forbidden City and many of the cultural heritage sites inside your own countries? What inspirations do they provide to you?
Yes, very much, very much. For instance, this very ancient place as the Forbidden City is something that makes us understand that there is modernity can be taken into our own countries in a different way.
Arima?
I think I'm always amazed at how much the human mind and the human hands have been able to create. You know, physical, poetry, art, music. We've also been able to destroy. So let's hope we don't do that. But I also realize the other thing. Life for us as human beings is short. And what has survived is the culture and the civilization, which means the collective. So it is not the I. You know, I often wonder why in India they used to talk about the soul coming back many times. I think it's because the idea was you can't learn enough in the short time you're on earth. Now, I don't know if I believe in reincarnation, but definitely I'm amazed at how much we have created, and I'm amazed at how much we have destroyed. And I wish we could carry on with the creative part and maintaining what is there across the world and stop destroying, because I don't think we can create those things anymore.
What a pleasure, ladies, to have both of you on our program. All the best. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.